To start now. Excellent. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa, where we discuss pertinent issues of peace and sustainability around the world and across Africa. Our theme today is Just War to Just Peace. Peace theology, peace ethics, and peace practice of Pope Francis. It's a topical and relevant theme. To help us discuss this topic is our guest speaker, Professor Dr. Stefan Silber. Dr. Silber teaches systematic theology at the University of Fechter in Germany and has been professor in Paderborn, Germany, and various other universities in Latin America. He specializes in liberation, post-colonial, and peace theologies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Stefan Silber.
Thank you very much, George.
It's a pleasure having you. And so please now feel free to start sharing your screen. And we are going all to be listening to you. And after your talk, we'll have some time for questions and discussions and sharing of experience. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much again, George. And thank you very much to everyone who is participating in this event. George already has mentioned the theme that I would like to address this afternoon at least in Germany, about peace theology, peace ethics, and practice of Pope Francis. I have been accompanying the pontificate of Pope Francis since the beginning, because as I am or have been always interested in Latin American theology, I was very much interested in what a Latin American Pope would do and in what ways he would change the Catholic Church and Catholic magisterium. And so I was overwhelmed from the beginning by the various insights of Pope Francis that he brought from his Latin American experience. And from the very beginning, he pronounced a very clear message towards peace and against every kind of war. And so I have started collecting these ideas of Pope Francis, trying to systemize a bit and trying to present them as a contribution from the Catholic Church to the construction of peace in the world. It's not only a Catholic perspective that the Pope presents, but as he is the Pope, it is a Catholic perspective and it is a theological perspective. But I think it goes far beyond theology, and it is a contribution to what we need today in our world in order to construct just peace. So let me present some ideas of what the Pope, in my criterion, represents in peace theology, peace ethics, and peace practice, and then we are going to discuss it. Throughout his pontificate, Pope Francis has never hidden the fact that he does not believe in war, but rather supports all people who work for peace using peaceful means. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti from 2020, he dedicates an entire chapter to the discussion of peace in the world. In it, he says, no, never again war, like Paul VI also did. This call for the end of the war for the Pope alludes to his predecessor, Paul VI, without mentioning him, who had also exclaimed in his address to the United Nations, "Never again one against the other, never, never again." And continuing, "Never again war, never again war. It is peace, peace that has to guide the destiny of all the nations of all mankind." End of quote of Paul VI, 1965. It aligns with other analysis, reflections, and teachings throughout the entire encyclical. The Pope's verdict against any kind of war is part of an impressive series of earlier documents, speeches, and statements in which he has taken a position against war and military preparations for war, rejected the arms trade, and favored non-violent politics. In addition to his 2017 World Day of Peace message and his two speeches in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, mention should be made of his own addresses to the UN General Assembly, alongside many other speeches, sermons, and messages. Pope Francis' commitment to non-violent means and opposition to war stems from his awareness of numerous wars and armed conflicts in many parts of the world. In his New Year's address to the members of the Diplomatic Corps in January 2023, Pope Francis spoke as often before of the dramatical interconnectedness of so many wars on the planet. He said, quote, "Today, the Third World War is taking place in a globalized world where conflicts involve only certain areas of the planet directly, but in fact involve them all. The closest and most recent example is certainly the war in Ukraine, with its wake of death and destruction. The present Third World War, fought piecemeal, also makes us consider other theaters of tension and conflict." End of quote. This piecemeal world war threatens to leave the world torn into pieces. In the same allocution, he expressed his desire for non-violent means to achieve peace. Quote, "The paths of peace are paths of solidarity, for no one can be saved alone. We live in a world so interconnected that, in the end, the actions of each have consequences for all." End of quote. In my presentation, I will show how Pope Francis rejects war and violence completely, and even goes so far as to abolish the traditional doctrine of just war. I will also present his plea for non-violent ways of peacemaking as an example of a hermeneutic of care, compassion, and concern towards just peace. The pontifical praxis of peacemaking corroborates Pope's interpretation of scripture and tradition and sets an example for a departure from just war to the construction of just peace. The rejection of war. In a broad analysis of the current reality of the planet, the Pope highlights in his letter addressed to all people of goodwill, Fratelli Tutti, numerous forms of violence, injustice, exploitation, exclusion, and even slavery that offend the rights and dignity of a large part of humanity. Francis analyzes a series of causes and roots of the many wars throughout the world that he characterizes as a world war fought piecemeal, as we have heard. Economic injustice and exploitation constitute for him central factors in the emergence of generalized violence. The neoliberal practices of the market economy cannot resolve global injustices, as they themselves claim, but instead exacerbate and perpetuate them. Economic measures deepen the growing division of society because both wealth and poverty continue to increase. Added to this is the manipulation of the exercise of politics, which does not serve as it should the interests of the community and the common good, but has become a, quote, prey of conflicting interests where victory consists in eliminating one's opponents, end of quote. An important factor that induces violence is, from the Pope's point of view, racism. Although it was assumed that this form of attack on human dignity had been overcome in past centuries, we can now find that it retreats underground only to keep re-emerging, as the Pope says. In Francis' analysis, it is one aspect of an economic and political culture that denies global fraternity and tends to oppose different social sectors. Another social phenomenon that was considered obsolete, slavery in all its forms, as the Pope says, is also still in force, turning human beings into more merchandise and private property. The Pope includes in this criticism the trafficking of human organs and human trafficking for sexual exploitation as other examples of a dehumanizing economy. Pope Francis also denounces the ravages that globalized patriarchy commits against a sisterly and fraternal society. Many women and girls must consider themselves doubly poor because, as the Pope says, quote, they endure situations of exclusion, mistreatment, and violence, since they are frequently less able to defend their rights, end of quote. However, the internal regime of the Church reflects the same violation of equality and rights of women in such an obvious way that the Pope's warning against structural inequality and violence produced by patriarchy is deeply weakened in this regard. These inequality, injustice, and different forms of violence deeply rooted in our culture and society are often maintained, according to the Pope, through lies and media disinformation. He writes, quote, war, terrorist attacks, racial or religious persecution, and many other affronts to human dignity are judged differently, depending on how convenient it proves for certain primarily economic interests. What is true, as long as it is convenient for someone in power, stops being true once it becomes inconvenient, end of quote. This distortion of truth and the manipulation of values can be identified as very effective cultural mechanisms to maintain and legitimize structures of violence and exclusion. In this way, Francis denounces deep divisions are produced between people so that some individuals seem to be of greater value than others. I quote, some parts of our human family, it appears, can be readily sacrificed for the sake of others, considered worthy of a carefree existence. Ultimately, persons are no longer seen as a paramount value to be cared for and respected, especially when they are poor and disabled, end of quote. Human beings can become like dispensable objects, as the Pope says. While he rejects this global situation of diversified violence, calling it a world war within postmodern parameters, he also firmly rejects any notion that these violent structures could be corrected or abolished by violent means. Violence can never be a solution for situations of violence. Even less will violence be able to end war. On the contrary, war is always a defeat in advance. He says, quote, every war leaves our world worse than it was before. War is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil, end of quote. In this context, the Pope definitely condemns all current forms of war. and instead calls for peaceful and healing solutions to the conflicts and divisions that plague the world today that lead towards the construction of just peace. So I pass to my idea that Pope definitely abolishes the idea of just war. The doctrine of a supposedly just war, which had been held for many centuries in the Catholic Church, already suffered a lot of delegitimization during the horrors of the 20th century. While in the two world wars of the first half of the century, many representatives of the local churches on the different sides praised war and extolled the participation of soldiers as if war enterprise were a Christian exercise. Self-critical reflection after 1945 led many to understand that they had allowed themselves to be manipulated and were actively involved in a manipulation of the Christian doctrine in favor of war. Under the impression of those horrific experiences and the complicity of parts of the Church, Pope John XXIII, in his encyclical Pacem in Terris, gave a first significant turn in the magisterium's doctrine of war. Pope Francis echoes this first clear distancing from the traditional doctrine. Quote, in the words of Saint John XXIII, it no longer makes sense to maintain that war is a fit instrument with which to repair the violation of justice. End of quote. It is obvious that for Pope John, this is not a departure in principle, since he does not question the doctrine of just war directly. However, faced with the destructive power of nuclear weapons, John XXIII readjusts the relationships between ends and means in the doctrine on war and opens the way to understand that the practice of war under these destructive conditions is ultimately absurd. Francis takes up this argument, deepens it, and radicalizes it, starting from the conviction reinforced by John XXIII, quote, that the arguments for peace are stronger than the confidence in the use of weapons, end of quote. Francis argues that in the present, considering the development of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and the enormous and growing possibilities offered by new technologies, the use of these increasingly destructive weapons must be considered increasingly irrational. The irrationality of war comes into view compared to the reasons for peace. The risks of war, as Pope Francis says, quote, will always be greater than its supposed benefits, end of quote. Faced with these situations, Pope Francis seriously calls into question the traditional doctrine of just war, noting that, quote, in recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly justified, end of quote. He denounces that these justifications should be qualified as excuses or even manipulation. He admits that the Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks of the possibility of legitimate defense by means of military force, which involves demonstrating that certain rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy have been met. These conditions, however, cannot be met under current military constellations, since the destruction caused by military means would be greater than the evil that war is supposed to solve, as it displays, quote, an uncontrollable destructive power of a great number of innocent civilians, end of quote. So according to the Pope's argument, the necessary requirements demanded within the doctrine of just war cannot be fulfilled in order to justify war today. For this reason, I quote, "It is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of just war, and we can no longer think of war as a solution." End of quote. It is very striking that in the corresponding footnote, the Pope even openly distances himself from St. Augustine, quote, "who forged a concept of just war that we no longer uphold in our own day." In the footnote, he says, St. Augustine forged a concept of just war that we no longer uphold in our own day, but the concept of St. Augustine is the pillar stone of any theory of just war over the last centuries in the Catholic Church. So with this innocuous footnote, the Pope says there is no longer any basis for a theory of just war in Catholic Church. What Pope Francis stated is not a definitive condemnation of the just war doctrine, nor does he order its eradication from the catechism, as he did with the death penalty. However, it leaves no room for its application under current military and political conditions. On the contrary, the pacifist attitude of resistance to wars, military threats, and armed security is revealed to be more rational and efficient, even though this might mean, quote Pope Francis, to be deemed naive for choosing peace. End of quote. Francis uses a similar argument on the issue of nuclear weapons. They are simply not rational, nor can they lead to the goals they are intended to achieve. Therefore, he emphatically demands that they should be considered immoral instruments and be abolished completely. The Pope bases his decision on several arguments. Foremost, he explains that nuclear weapons cannot provide a solution to current challenges. I quote, "If we take into consideration the principal threats to peace and security, as, for example, terrorism, asymmetrical conflicts, cybersecurity, environmental problems, poverty, not a few doubts arise regarding the inadequacy of nuclear deterrence as an effective response to such challenges." The Pope continues that, secondly, these weapons have dire consequences that would nullify any goal that a war between nations was intended to achieve. I quote, "These concerns are even greater when we consider the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences that would follow from any use of nuclear weapons with devastating, indiscriminate, and uncontainable effects over time and space." End of quote. Thirdly, he also denies the pacifying effect of the use of the atomic bomb for deterrence. He says, I quote, we need also to ask ourselves how sustainable is a stability based on fear when it actually increases fear." End of quote. Fear cannot be a driver of security, not even among nations. It is for these reasons that the Pope advocates the total elimination of nuclear weapons. However, and leaving the immediate context of Fratelli Tutti, the Pope is not satisfied with slow processes of international negotiations on nuclear disarmament. In a speech in Hiroshima in 2019, he questioned the incessant production of nuclear weapons. He says, I quote, "How can we speak of peace even as we build terrifying new weapons of war?" End of quote. The Pope even improvised within the prepared text that, quote, the possessing of nuclear weapons is immoral, end of quote. The Pope demands with urgency the abolition of nuclear weapons and declares their mere possession as something immoral. This phrase apparently caused a diplomatic dissonance between nuclear power France and the Holy See. In 2023, the Pope repeated this verdict in his address to the diplomatic corps, now without any spontaneous interruption and in full conscience of the possible diplomatic consequences. Quote, I can only reaffirm that the possession of atomic weapons is immoral, end of quote. The Pope's rejection of nuclear weapons as immoral must be read in this context, not only their use, whether in war or for so-called deterrence, but also their production, handling, and possession must be eliminated to ensure peace. And third step to the abolition of war is what the Pope says about industry and commerce of death, as he himself calls it. Pope Francis clearly distances himself from the production and trade of arms, not only nuclear arms, but arms in general. During his visit to Nagasaki in 2019, the Pope emphasized, quote, our attempts to speak out against the arms race will never be enough. The arms race wastes precious resources that could be better used to benefit the integral development of peoples and to protect the natural environment. In view of this, end of quote. In view of this pressing global needs of humanity, quote, the money that is squandered and the fortunes made through the manufacture, upgrading, maintenance, and sale of ever more destructive weapons are an affront crying out to heaven, end of quote. The production of weapons, therefore, in the Pope's opinion, is a crime against the poor and against nature, which he qualifies as an injustice and a serious sin. On another occasion, when addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2020, he used words even more critical of the arms industry. Quote, we need to dismantle the perverse logic that links personal and national security to the possession of weaponry. This logic serves only to increase the profits of the arms industry, while fostering a climate of distrust and fear between persons and peoples, end of quote. Finally, in a much less formal act, when spontaneously answering questions from school children, he condemned in an even more drastic and almost offensive way those responsible for the production and marketing of weapons. Quote, why is it that so many powerful people don't want peace? Because they live on war. The arms industry, this is grave. It is the industry of death, and they profit. So much is sacrificed and war is made to protect the money. And because of this, many people don't want peace. There is more profit with war. There's more profit with war. End of quote, Pope Francis 2015 in a talk to school children. Now I'll turn the page around and talk about Pope Francis not criticizing violence, but as a teacher of peace and non-violence. Pope Francis has repeatedly insisted on the necessity to oppose and end wars and create just peace by using peaceful means. As early as September 2013, he called for a vigil of prayer for peace in Syria. During his homily on that event, he said, quote, war always marks the failure of peace. It is always a defeat for humanity, End of quote. And quoting his predecessor, Paul VI, he continued, quote, peace expresses itself only in peace. A peace which is not separate from the demands of justice, but which is fostered by personal sacrifice, clemency, mercy, and love. End of quote. In the following years, the Pope has clarified what it means to him to consider war as a defeat for humankind and the necessity to construct just peace, which he presents as only being possible if it is done in a peaceful and non-violent way. I quote, violence leads to more violence, hatred to more hatred, death to more death. We must break this cycle, which seems inescapable, end of quote. To break this vicious circle, the practice of non-violence is the preferable, most efficient, and most consistent option. In his message for the World Day of Peace on January 2017, the Pope had proposed non-violence as a style of politics for peace. In this message, the Pope insists on the power of non-violent action, which is more powerful than violence. He presents men and women from around the world and from many religions as examples to follow on the path of non-violence, asserts the evangelical fidelity of non-violence, explicitly mentioning the Sermon on the Mount, and calls on, quote, political leaders, religious leaders, the heads of international institutions, and business and media executives to apply the Beatitudes in the exercise of their respective responsibilities, end of quote. That is, to apply non-violent measures to build peace. The Pope connects this non-violent politics with construction of just peace. He presents various important tasks in this project. First, the call to solve conflicts based on the truth. I quote, those who were fierce enemies have to speak from the stark and clear truth. Only by basing themselves on the historical truths of events will they be able to make a broad and persevering effort to understand one another and to strive for a new synthesis for the good of all, end of quote. Notably, the insistence on the stark and clear truth resonates with the practice of satyagraha developed by Mohandas Gandhi, and which means firmness in truth on the non-violent path to peace. Francis proposes a second necessary element for building just peace, memory. Because, quote, silence can lead to complicity in grave misdeeds and sins, end of quote. The victims demand remembrance because, quote, we can never move forward without remembering the past. We do not progress without an honest and unclouded memory, end of quote. The Pope mentioned some crucial examples of the need for memory. The Shoah, he writes, must not be forgotten, nor the atomic bombs, the persecutions, the slave trade, the ethnic killings, as well as the many other historical events that make us ashamed of our humanity, end of quote. At the same time, he insists that to remember goodness is also a healthy thing. To achieve peace, we must also remember those who have dedicated themselves to the construction of a just peace using peaceful means. Human beings, the Pope calls artisans of peace. Memory must lead to justice. For this reason, the Pope condemns impunity, but also revenge. Quote, justice is properly sought solely out of love of justice itself, out of respect for the victims, as a means of preventing new crimes and protecting the common good, not as an alleged outlet for personal anger. End of quote. Justice for Francis does not contradict the search for reconciliation and forgiveness. Rather, both processes must accompany each other. There can be no forgiveness through forgetting, but only with memory and justice for the victims. The Pope explains, quote, "Loving an oppressor does not mean allowing him to keep oppressing us or letting him think that what he does is acceptable. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression." End of quote. Recognizing one's neighbor, even in the adversary or oppressor, is the attitude of mercy that must characterize Christian nonviolence in the search for peace. It is not a mercy of oblivion, impunity, or concealment, but that mercy that seeks justice and the conversion of those who do evil. But this attitude of mercy excludes all forms of violence that attempt against the life of other human beings, especially all kinds of warfare. For Pope Francis, the practice of nonviolence in the pursuit of just peace is not only the best instrument for the resolution of conflicts, but also the spiritual characteristic of those who follow Jesus Christ. For this reason, he reminds everyone that Jesus Christ never promoted violence, and that the early communities of the church lived without violently defending themselves, even in persecution, and that, on the contrary, they called to respond to grievances with peaceful and non-violent means. This did not mean they avoided conflicts when they appeared inevitable, but rather they lived them with a non-violent spirituality based on their faith in a God who created all human beings and could be encountered and experienced through them, also through the opponents in the conflict. This faith can also guide us today, because, I quote, "We should never confine others to what they may have said or done, but value them for the promise that they embody, a promise that always brings with it a spark of new hope." You have the quotation there in the slide. I think it is quite important. Never confine others to what they may have said or done, but hope for a promise that God has hidden in them. End of quote. Contemplating the adversary from the perspective of promise and hope are attitudes that allow non-violent action, that allow us to live and resolve conflicts without hurting the other or taking revenge on them, while continuing to seek relentlessly for justice and truth. Promise and hope help us open ourselves to the new potentialities, possibilities that God can bring forth in the midst of conflict without resorting to violence. Francis proposes several spiritual values to be practiced and deepened in nonviolent action for peace. These values are in full harmony with secular attitudes proposed for nonviolent activists. The Pope invites us to cultivate inner peace as a remedy and antidote against interpersonal and social hatred. He continues with a call to goodness that awakens profound joy even in the midst of difficulties and misunderstandings. Even when affronted, he says, goodness is never weak, but rather shows its strength by refusing to take revenge, end quote. In the same way, he continues to recommend mercy, which heals the injuries caused by mistakes, misunderstandings, and disputes. Fraternity, sorority, as in the entire encyclical Fratelli Tutti, and truth, active memory, and the search for justice as detailed already. Pope Francis is aware that the practice of these values and the non-violent solution to conflicts are no easy matters. On the contrary, quote, social peace demands hard work, craftsmanship, end of work. It is, end of quote. It is a work that must be done by hand, personally, from the heart, and with a sound spirituality. It is a work that requires the daily search for inner peace and self-conversion. It is a path of following Jesus Christ that requires similarity with him even in persecution. It also contains, however, the promises of the fellowship of Jesus, including the hope of the resurrection. The Pope also sets an example for dialogue with other Christian churches and other religions for the sake of peace. In his words, quote, a journey of peace is possible between religions. The different religions contribute significantly to building fraternity and defending justice in society. End of quote. The Pope has signed a joint document with the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib from Cairo on human brother and sisterhood for world peace and common existence in 2019. They say, quote, that they resolutely declare that religions must never incite war, hateful attitudes, hostility, and extremism, nor must they incite violence or the shedding of blood, end of quote. When attempts are made to justify violence or war with religion, the Pope and the Grand Imam classify this as abuse and deviation. What is the underlying theological assumption for all these ideas of the Pope? It is a perspective of care and compassion. Pope Francis' approach to nonviolent peacemaking is characterized by a certain reading of Christian scripture and tradition. He indicates clearly the perspective that orients him to this type of understanding. I quote, let us not remain mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us look once more at all those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Let us think of the refugees and displaced, those who suffered the effects of atomic radiation or chemical attacks, the mothers who lost their children, and the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. Let us hear the true stories of these victims of violence. Look at reality through their eyes and listen with an open heart to the stories they tell. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war. End of quote. It is the civilian victims, refugees, women, children, among others, who tell the truth about war. It is for this reason that it is necessary to relate to them physically, touch their wounds, listen to them and feel with them. People cannot be considered collateral damage, as the Pope emphasizes. He rejects any form of violence against a fellow human being. There is no distinction here between violent acts committed under the pretext of a good cause and the violence of an aggressor. The bodies of the victims of both kinds of violence display the same kind of wounds. The truth of the victims of violence, as the Italian original of the text says, the truth, not only the stories of truth or the true stories, but the truth of the victims of violence serves as a criterion not only to understand the evil nature of war, but also to understand every other human project, including the interpretation of scripture and tradition. While commenting on the biblical narration of the Good Samaritan, the Pope writes, quote, The decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. End of quote. It is this perspective of care and compassion that determines the Pope's approach to reality and to Scripture. The Pope underscores this fundamental significance of compassion for the understanding of Scripture also by repeatedly referring to the story of Cain and Abel. Despite the individual differences of those sons of Adam and Eve, quote, their profound identity and their vocation is to be brothers, end of quote. Their story, he continues, brings out the difficult task to which all men and women are called, to live as one, each taking care of the other, end of quote. And 2 years later, on the occasion of that year's message for the world of peace, Pope Francis returns to Genesis 4, to the story of Cain and Abel, commenting, quote, Cain said that he did not know what happened to his brother, that he was not his brother's keeper. He did not feel responsible for his life, for his fate. He did not feel involved. He was indifferent to his brother, despite their common origin. How sad. What a sorry tale of brothers, of families, of human beings. This was the first display of indifference between brothers. God, however, is not indifferent. Abel's blood had immense value in his eyes, and he asked Cain to give an account of it. At the origin of the human race, God shows himself to be involved in human's destiny. End of quote. Pope Francis' way of interpreting the scriptures involves himself and those who listen to or read his interpretations. It is impossible for the Pope to stay indifferent, seeing that God himself is not indifferent to human suffering. We feel drawn into the story narrated by the Bible. We ourselves stand together with our brother on the field, or as the Pope writes in relation to the story of the Good Samaritan, quote, all of us have in ourselves something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the passers-by, and something of the Good Samaritan, end of quote. Pope Francis' perspective of care and compassion let us read Scripture as a key to our own reality, and at the same time understand our own reality out of the perspective of those who suffer from the truth of the victims of violence, considering and touching their wounds and listening to their stories. The Pope's perspective of care and compassion leads us to identify personally and spiritually with the victims of violence. This is the reason why the Pope ascertains, quote, every act of violence committed against a human being is a wound in humanity's flesh. Every violent death diminishes us as people. Violence leads to more violence, hatred to more hatred, death to more death. We must break this cycle, which seems inescapable. End of quote. In context of violence and structural exclusions, the friendship with the poor, desired by the Pope, is not always an easy matter. It is striking that Francis, when insisting on the need to make contact with the wounds, also reflects on the problems that this attempt can entail. Even if the victims resist to the attempts to approach them, this resistance needs to be accepted as an effect of the structural violence from which they suffer. Quote, if at times the poor and the dispossessed react with attitudes that appear anti-social, we should realize that in many cases those reactions are born of a history of scorn and social exclusion. End of quote. And I pass to my final chapter of the hermeneutic of praxis in Pope Francis. There is another important strategy that the Pope employs to express his interpretation of scripture and tradition, and to show the range of his intent to transform and convert the doctrine and the life of the Church. It is his praxis. The Pope is a religious leader, not only a theologian. His authority does not express itself only through what he thinks, teaches, and writes, but also through his actions. In order to understand Pope Francis' stance toward just peace, it is therefore fundamental to study his praxis of peace and the hermeneutic of scripture and tradition this praxis reveals. Furthermore, the Pope's praxis shows the scope of his magisterium. Just peace is for Pope Francis not only something to believe in and to hope for, but the result of just and non-violent actions. In the first place, it is obvious to allude to the Pope's and to the Holy See's politics of diplomacy. In numerous conflicts around the globe, the Pope, together with his diplomatic apparatus, is working incessantly towards negotiations, ceasefires, and humanitarian assistance, trying to engage as many parties as possible. He was the first Pope in history to meet a Russian patriarch, Cyril I, as depicted here in the first picture above, 2016 in Havana, an encounter made possible, among many others, by the socialist government of Cuba. From the first days of the war in Ukraine on, Pope Francis has tried to use these connections as a basis for peace talks with Patriarch Cyril and other Russian leaders. As early as the 25th of February in 2022, on the second day of the war, Pope Francis himself visited the Russian ambassador to the Vatican, which is an extremely unusual procedure because a head of state normally orders a diplomat to come to him and does not go to visit him. But the Pope wanted to make clear how important this concern is to him. Politics must be non-violent. Every form of violence must be ended and rejected as a matter of urgency. In the month of May of 2023, he also received the Ukrainian President Zelensky in the Vatican. And now again, last week, Zelensky has been received by the Pope in the Vatican. These and many other diplomatic processes are intensified by the second thread of Pope Francis' praxis for peace, his visits to other countries and the choice of his destinations. The Pope has visited Palestine and Israel, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, South Sudan, and many states with a Muslim majority. But he has traveled to Western states like France and the US only in order to visit international institutions like the United Nations that are located there. This choice of destinations follows the same idea of compassion and care and gives it a clear expression. It is from the location of the people who suffer violence that you can gain, in the view of Pope Francis, the right perspective to understand just peace and the way to reach it. And the third element of the Pope's praxis for just peace that I would like to mention here are his prayers for peace. And this is represented here in the second photo, Pope with the Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople and the presidents of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, and then Israel, Shimon Peres, when they were invited to the Vatican to a prayer for peace, the two presidents of the two states and the Patriarch and the Pope praying together for peace in the Holy Land. Throughout his pontificate, the Pope has invited repeatedly to pray for just peace in Syria, in Palestine and Israel, in many African countries he has visited, and ultimately also for the peace in Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine again. Unlike other religious leaders, Pope Francis does not pray for the victory of one party or another. He prays for the victims and for the refugees. He prays for politicians and other leaders, and he prays for his own conversion and the conversion of the Church towards just peace. His prayers for peace indicate that peace does not only depend on the exit of politics and diplomacy and the efforts of individuals in their pursuit of justice and peace. For the Pope, just peace is a spiritual journey that includes politics, diplomacy, personal commitment, conversion, hope, prayer, and lamentation. It cannot be gained by prayers alone, but it depends on the praxis on many people, institutions, and governments involved. The commitment to interreligious dialogue noted above, including the spiritual dialogue it often entails, might be indicated as another important element of the Pope's praxis for peace. Thank you very much for your attention, this lengthy talk that I've given now, and now I'm very open to our discussion.
Thank you so much indeed, Stefan Silber, for this wonderful presentation. You've taken us through, the thinking and practice of Pope Francis, from just war to just peace. Great ideas. And now it's time for us to reflect and ask questions on the many issues that you've raised, including economic injustice and exploitation, challenges from racism, patriarchy, distortion of truth, and manipulation of values. And so we're going to ask now members who are present here to ask questions, share their own experience and hopes for a better world that is more peaceful than it is today. So you may raise your hand, and please just also say who you are, just so that we know each other. That's always nice. Do I see any hands? I don't see. Yes, Hubert. I can see Hubert. And yes, please start.
Janet, next.
And also Janet. I see Janet waving. Maybe no virtual hand, but waving.
Okay. Please proceed, and then we'll go to Janet.
Thank you. Without talking about me, maybe later, second question. A first remark of this very interesting detail of your presentation, Mr. Silber, the deliberate choice of destinations for his traveling. So sorry to bring in a very German perspective to this meeting, as you also speak from Vechta. I would like to enhance the efforts to invite the Pope for lobbying in Germany, so that finally, within his own reflection on nuclear weapons, Germany may sign the treaty against nuclear weapons. Because we have a very bad situation in Germany, where since years and years, no politician and no government is courageous enough. A country without nuclear weapons, there are the American ones here in Germany, yes, but not owned by German. A country without nuclear weapons not signing this treaty. And I am happy to be also in one of the platforms in Rwanda, together with Christian associations, because we are trying to convince the Rwanda government to sign the anti-nuclear weapon treatment. But maybe we can call the Pope and remind him to choose next time Germany, but for a deliberate reason, not just for diplomacy. Thank you very much. It's not really a question, huh? Sorry. Just a reaction by motion of your information. Thank you, Mr. Silber.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, please proceed, Stefan.
Yeah, I'm quite d'accord with this idea that the Pope might come to Germany to implore our government to finally sign the treaty on nuclear weapons ban. But I think that's subject to the Pope's decision, not mine. And the Pope prefers his travels to countries that really show his own preference and his own perspective from the margins, from the peripheries. And maybe he is trusting very much our own capabilities to pressure our government to finally sign this treaty.
Thank you so much. Janet?
Yes, hello. Thank you for your presentation, of which I have little expertise, and so I especially appreciate your what you've explained. And I'm working on the idea of progress, which activists are fighting about. And one indication of progress that I heard from my perspective in your talk was the idea that the Pope was not blessing one side to win or the other, but hoping for the end of war. And I see that as a very significant step in human progress and quote civilization. But I wanted to put the question out of progress to the whole group too, so that it can sort of hang over the way we think about your talk, which also has roots in ancient workings for peace. And my name is Janet Gerson. I'm the education director of the International Institute on Peace Education, and I'm in New York. Thank you. Any other indicators of progress from your perspective from the Vatican? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would say progress has two sides. The development of the nuclear bomb was a kind of progress. It was a scientific progress and a military progress to have these most destructive weapons at hand and be able to kill thousands of people at the same time. This also is a kind of progress. The progress that I have tried to present from the perspective of Pope Francis is only the other side of this ambivalent concept. There may be human progress when we learn to see a creation of God in our opponent, in our adversary. But it is not a progress that was impossible to our ancestors. That's why the Pope always goes back to the first stories of the Bible, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. These are paradigmatic situations between humans that have been present from the beginning. We are not progressing in humanity as if everything always tends to be better. Sometimes we have to fear that everything turns to be worse than it has been. But this also is not the case. We are always before the same situation as Cain has been. Will he kill his brother or won't he? It's his own decision. He can decide. He needs not kill his brother. But in the story, he does. And why does he? And how can we prevent ourselves from killing our brother? That's the question we always have to deal with. And the only progress we can make is within our own self, I think.
Excellent. And Donna, you are welcome.
Thank you. I'm very late, and I apologize for that. I saw only the last slide, and I noted that it says something about conversions. And I want to ask a question to everybody. Throughout my childhood, every Sunday, Father Hack or Father Michael admonished us to go out and convert Protestants and Jews. And we didn't know how to convert anybody. But I'm wondering, is the church ever going to dignify other Christian religions or other religions in general with ascription of equal status? Protestants don't do that. Protestants don't try to get their kids, 9-year-olds, to go and convert Catholics and Jews, and there were no Muslims at that time in America. I'm wondering what's with the Catholic preoccupation with converting people to Catholicism, whether they like it or not. You can tell I missed the whole lecture.
Well, I wasn't talking about that kind of conversion, and the Pope either is talking about that kind of conversion. He was thinking, or he was praying for the conversion of himself, I said, and for the conversion of political and other leaders to peace, to justice and peace. That's the kind of conversion the Pope is trying to effect by his prayers, and starting with himself. I need to be converted again and again to just peace. And only then I can also pray for the conversion of others, but not to Catholic faith or to Christianity, but to peace. That was the idea I wanted to express with the last slide.
Okay, now I understand. And please forgive me for being late and missing most of it. But that's a good clarification.
Thank you so much, Donna, for that question, and Stefan for the answer. Jimmy, and then we'll go to Sean. Jimmy, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Silber. I think every effort for peace is so important. And I want to inspire the group here that meeting in this group is one of the keys for peace. I think we have the historic situation that we can communicate around the globe since few years on this Zoom or other technical possibilities. And that is the basic idea of our peace concept, which we developed the last year. I want to inspire you to join us for this global peace communication project. And I will put my data into the chat, and everybody is welcome to join us, because I think we should use this opportunity to communicate everybody who wants peace and who has the knowledge to bring our capacities together. I think this is a great thing, and thank you very much for all your efforts in this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Sean, please, you're welcome. Then go to Dasu.
Well, yeah, thank you, George. My name is Sean English, and I'm based here in Ireland. And my background is in peace studies. And I'd like to thank the professor for such a broad analysis of the Pope's approach to the problems of war. Just a question I have is about, still at the heart of the just war theory is the idea of the legitimate right to self-defense. And I'm just, maybe this, could you just say a little bit about that for me again, how we're handling that, because people still refer back to that right, legitimate right of self-defense. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That's exactly the problem at the heart of the actual discussion. How can we negate the right to self-defense in the present conflicts? And the Pope does not negate the right to self-defense, but to violent means of self-defense. And he inclusively insists on that. He says, I do not negate the right of self-defense to nobody. Of course, we must defend ourselves, but it depends very much on the means we use to that defense. And in the face of the destructiveness of modern weapons, he says it is no longer rational to use weapons for self-defense, because that is no longer only self-defense, but always kind of aggression. And the other argument is what I have exposed, that the Pope says the idea of self-defense has been abused in the past. And almost every war in the last 50 years has been some kind of self-defense. And it cannot be that the idea of self-defense is so much abused. And so he prefers kinds of methods of self-defense that are non-violent. And that is what he says positively. We must not accept the aggressor when he tries to oppress or tries to use his own violent means. We must not accept that, but try to stop him with non-violent means.
Excellent. Dasu, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. George. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much for your good presentation. From Tanzania. I would like to thank the professor for a very good presentation. It's really comprehensive. Professor, I would like to hear your comments. I remember last year, Pope Francis made a comment about the war between Russia and Ukraine. And he said this, quote unquote, Ukraine should raise, it's time for Ukraine to raise a white flag, meaning to capitulate. So my question is, why do you think the Pope made such comments, urging Ukraine to surrender rather than keeping fighting? And secondly, that Pope was taking side. Those are my questions, Professor. Thank you.
I'm afraid I didn't get the second part of the question. There was a gap in the communication.
Okay. The second part of the question is the Pope's comment. Does that mean the Pope was taking side?
I will begin with the second part. Yes, he was taking the side of the victims. That's always the side he takes. He doesn't take the side of the aggressor or of the one who defends himself militarily. He takes the side of victims. That is very clearly in Pope Francis. He does not take side in a military conflict, but only with the victims. That is clearly the case in the Pope's practice in the last years. Now for the other communication, it was the setting was an interview, and the interviewer asked the Pope about the white flag. And if I remember well, the Pope didn't even repeat the words white flag, but he said that is a possible way to end a war. And the white flag does not only mean capitulation and surrender, but the white flag is also the sign of parliamentary, is the sign of the one who tries to negotiate, is the one who goes unarmed to the side of the enemy with a white flag in hand, not to surrender, but to negotiate how we can solve the conflict without violence. So it was not exactly clear what the Pope intended to say. And he was clearly not saying Ukraine should surrender or capitulate. And even if he had said it, it would be in line with his teachings, because the worst thing that can happen in war is that war does not finish, that war continues. And so I think the Pope would even support a capitulation if it leads to the end of war and the beginning of negotiations, because there is no war that ends without negotiations. Even a capitulation leads to negotiations. How can we fix the terms of this capitulation? So the important thing with the white flag is not the surrender or the capitulation, but to come to terms and begin to negotiate one with one another.
Excellent. Hubert, please.
Thank you again. If you allow, this time a real question. But before, thank you also to Jimmy for this appeal, saying we are already in a kind of acting for peace in using these technologies. I speak to you from Nairobi. I am a member of board of the African Peace University, and we are actually starting a course of peace training in Africa this year within the campaign of rethinking Africa security. And we are very much supported by these expressions and thoughts and thinking and spiritual depth of Pope Francis about this his reflection and sector of the business of war, where you also mentioned Mr. Silber. My question is that if you found, according to this thinking about weapons and the commerce of weapons, if you found also thoughts and analysis of the new autonomous war system, because we have the nuclear bomb, new approach, completely new approach of autonomous weapon systems. So if we may think about this balance of fear, thank you, Mr. Silber, you are very clear that fear is an element of insecurity and never security. So, but maybe there was a kind of, in the 60s, 70s, wherever, a kind of fear, a human feeling fear, preventing the use of nuclear weapons and further use of nuclear weapons. We will not have it in autonomous weapon systems. We go into killing by error, by miscalculation of a computer. So are you in this? Did you find something, at least briefly, or you just give a source? Because this would also be very, very necessary, I think, to have this kind of thinking from the Pope's perspective, blaming it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. As far as I have read, the Pope has not written anything on the subject explicitly. But of course, this is part of his analysis that modern day arms are really. There are some intruders in this conference. I don't recognize them, but I hear voices.
Yeah, that's a mistake. Somehow I can also hear that, but please proceed.
Yes. So as far as I know, the Pope hasn't written on the subject, but of course he has analyzed the problem of modern day weapons that are always more destructive, more dangerous, and more risky. And surely those autonomous weapons that eliminate human decision, they make their decisions alone and know how to kill and whom to kill, and the weapons themselves decide whom they will kill, are a clear example of a modern day problematic of arms industry, arms technology. I do not think that autonomous weapons really are autonomous. That's another problem, because somebody launches them and somebody makes the software so that they work. So there are still human responsibilities behind the autonomy of these autonomous weapons. And I think we need to address these human responsibilities as well.
Excellent. Gordon Matthews, you're welcome.
Thank you. Gordon Matthews. I work for Pax Christi in the Archdiocese of Paderborn. I'm very impressed by France's clear rejection of war and violence and his very clear stance in favor of active non-violence. What would interest me is how he has come to this conviction, whether who has influenced him, whether it's Leonardo Boff or others. If anyone can tell me what has brought him to this very clear denunciation of war and violence and promotion of active non-violence.
Thank you very much, Gordon. It's a pleasure to meet you here in this context. I would answer, I don't know. Well, I don't know. I would answer, I would suppose the gospel has taught him. And his experiences with military dictatorship in Argentina. And his experience with wars in all parts of the world. In Latin America, there has not been a major war in the last decades, but a lot of military violence. There has been a war for the Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas, in between Great Britain and Argentina in the time of the military dictatorship. But a major war like we see now in Palestine and Israel and Lebanon or in Ukraine, there has not been such a major war. But the Pope has studied conflicts and wars throughout the world. And that's why he keeps repeating, we are in a third world war fought piecemeal. This is not a scenario of different small wars throughout the world, but this is one huge conflict between different interests, not only two interests, but a lot of different interests throughout the world. And I think he has learned to confront this kind of violence with the gospel. And the gospel tells us clearly not to use violence. And the whole Bible, from the beginning, stories of the killing of the brother, tells us not to use violence. Although it is used with frequency in the Bible, but the prophets and everyone in the Bible always says, this is not the way to solve a conflict. And Jesus gives us his examples in the Sermon on the Mount, in which he explains how we find better ways to solve conflicts.
Thank you so much. And Evelyn, welcome.
Thank you very much. Like the others, I've learned a lot through this very expansive presentation. I hear that there's value in the condemnation of the just. I'd like to start with what I've heard about the results of the Pope's statements. And clearly, the condemnation of just war is huge. There's the value of influencing followers on an individual level when he visits the various countries and leaders of countries too. My question is, can you give specific examples for actions that have resulted from these visits? I mean, something where one can say, what is this? And I know that it's very difficult because many of them occur behind the scenes. Like in most peace movements, the real impact is in conversations that one cannot hear, because otherwise they would lose their potency. So with that qualification, I would ask that question.
Thank you. That's quite a difficult and a serious question. And the Pope himself recognizes it. the first years of his pontificate, he was part of conflict negotiation in South Sudan. There have been other people in the Vatican and in church institutions that have tried to bring about a conflict solution in South Sudan. And in the end, they managed to get the conflict partners to the Vatican and sign a document in the presence of the Pope. And when the Pope blessed them for the farewell, he himself knelt down and kissed the shoes of the delegates of the conflict partners in order to obligate them that they need to obey their own signatures and the treaty they had signed in the Vatican at that time. And some years later, I think it was 2023 or 2022, I suppose 2023, because it was after COVID-19, the Pope traveled to South Sudan, and he himself said, we need to reinforce the treaty then made because it hadn't had the effect that was hoped for. So the Pope himself recognizes it is not easy to solve conflicts by negotiation. And he knows that from his own experience, although he had committed himself personally at a very intense level in these negotiations. And as I said, he publicly, before the cameras of the Vatican, knelt down and kissed the feet of the people who had signed the treaty. Only the male parts of the delegation, not the women that had been present. This was quite interesting also to see at the moment, but that's only between brackets. Now the Pope traveled again to South Sudan and not said, oh, you fools, you have spoiled everything, but have continued to work in this same line to reach negotiations and reach an agreement between the conflict partners. So it is not easy to have success in the works of peace. That's what Bob's saying. That is craftsmanship. We need hard work. We need to do it again and again. Although we think we have reached a solution, we need to continue our work in this fight for peace.
Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Stefan. And we are slowly now coming to the end. I'm going to ask you to say, give us something to take home, because you already given us a lot, but maybe for one sentence or two. But actually, when you said that Francis got this kind of inspiration from the gospel, that's quite true. And I should probably also add that even the choice of the name Francis, because it's after Francis of Assisi, who is very known for his peace, peace for everybody and peace for nature, peace for everything, right? So I think the choice of the name was really deliberate. And so thank you so much. And I thank everybody also who has participated in this. So Stefan, if you can please say one more sentence or two.
Is there one thing that I always I'm thinking about myself is the idea of the spark of hope that God has inserted in every human being, and the promise that is present even in my enemy. And I think that's one thing we always have to remind us ourselves of. There is no such thing as an enemy or an adversary or an opponent. All those are our brothers and sisters, and God has inserted in them a promise and a spark of hope. And although maybe sometimes we are not able to recognize that spark of hope, we may believe that it is present because we believe that God has made all those men and women in his image and likeness. Thank you very much for being present, and thank you very much for discussing about the peace theology of Pope Francis.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Stefan, and welcome back again. If you can, we are always here every Wednesday. And thank you everybody for your time and your contributions and your presence. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.